Dust lay heavy on the land, as if the earth itself had given up breathing. The ranch stretched empty across miles of broken fence, dead grass, and silence. A man lived there, alone, silent, carrying no hope but the rhythm of work. His name was Ethan. His days were simple, stripped of meaning: mend the corral, fetch water, sit by the stove until night came. He had not spoken to anyone in weeks. The cattle were gone, the horses too. Only the wind knew his name now. That morning he saddled his horse to ride along the edge of his property. The sun had not yet burned away the night's coolness. He saw nothing unusual until he noticed a shape beneath a tree near the dry creek bed. At first it looked like an abandoned blanket, brown with dust, lying motionless. He rode closer. The shape moved. Ethan stopped, slid down from the saddle, and approached. The blanket was wrapped around something, or someone. He saw a woman's face, bruised and swollen, barely breathing. Her wrists were bound with rough rope. Her lips moved, faint as the rustle of grass. "Leave me to die," she whispered. Ethan froze. The words carried no anger, only exhaustion. He crouched, unsure what to do. The sun cast sharp light over her wounds. Cuts, burns, old scars layered over fresh. Whoever had left her here had wanted her gone from the world. His hand hovered over the blanket. For a moment, he thought of turning away. The ranch was already heavy with ghosts. His wife buried out back, his son lost to fever years ago. Bringing another broken soul inside felt like tempting fate, but something in her eyes stopped him. They were not pleading, they were resigned, as if she had already buried herself. Slowly, Ethan opened the blanket. What he saw made his breath catch. Her body was covered in blood and dirt, but beneath it, faint marks showed burned symbols carved into her skin. Not just cruelty, ritual. Whoever had done this wanted to erase her, to strip her of being. Ethan staggered back, gripping the edge of the blanket as if it might burn him. For a long time he stood frozen. The woman lay silent, waiting for him to walk away. But Ethan knew he couldn't. He had once walked away before, when fever took his boy. He had sworn never again. He cut the ropes from her wrists. She did not resist, did not thank him. Her eyes simply closed, as if she had already accepted death. Ethan lifted her carefully. She weighed less than he expected. He placed her on his horse, climbed up behind, and turned toward the ranch. The ride back was slow, the land stretching endless, quiet except for the creak of leather and her shallow breathing. He kept his arms steady around her, as though holding her soul in place. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was sinking. He laid her on the bed that had been empty for years. He fetched water, cleaned her wounds, said nothing. Her breath rattled in her chest, but she lived. Night fell. Ethan sat by the window, rifle across his knees, staring at the dark horizon. He knew leaving her there would have been easier, but in her broken silence, he had seen something that mirrored himself. A life cut down, waiting for nothing. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of choice. Morning came thin and gray. The stove still held a small red heart. Ethan fed it in quiet. Chips first, then a split log. Steam rose from the tin kettle, soft as breath. She lay on the bed, eyes half open, watching him the way a wild thing watches water. He brought a basin, clean cloth, boiled the muslin, waited until heat turned kind. He cleaned the burns and the carved marks without hurry. She didn't flinch. When his hand shook once, he set the cloth down and steadied it on the table with a flat palm. Then he went on. Her lips were cracked. He broke a crust and dipped it in broth until it could be trusted. She ate in small bites. The sound of the spoon against the tin cup was the only talk in the room. When she finished, she turned her face to the wall and slept again. Not deep, but chosen. He stepped outside. Day had the color of tin. Wind licked the grass flat. He walked the fence line with a lantern he did not need, counting posts under his breath. Near the wash he saw it, a heel mark pressed hard, a nick cut from the leather like a moon missing a tooth. He knelt. The print faced the house. He smoothed it with his palm until it was only wet earth in a memory. Back inside, she was sitting, back straight, blanket pulled to the throat. She held the muslin in her fingers, turning the edge as if checking a seam. He set water and coffee on, then placed a short board on the table. Clean wood, pencil beside it, point sharp. You have a name you'll keep? He asked low. A beat, then the smallest tilt. Ruth, she said, the word dry, but whole. He nodded once, wrote Ruth on the back corner, small and square, and didn't nail it anywhere. He left it where her hand could find it when the day allowed. He stoked the stove, mended the door latch, lifted the gate on a shoulder so the hinge wouldn't scream. She swept the floor with a willow broom he cut from the creek, strokes neat, corners first. When the wind pulled at the eaves, he climbed to tamp the shingle. When pain pulled at her side, she sat, breathed slow, and let it pass like weather. By noon, he set a pot of beans with onion and one tight fist of pork. The house took the smell and decided to be a home for a while. She wrapped the bandages tighter, hands sure now, and checked each knot as if it might lie. He said nothing. Trust his work. They both did it with their hands. He saddled the bay and left the rifle on its peg where sunlight could warn off fools. South fence, he said. She looked at the bucket by the door. I'll keep the fire honest. Wind pushed grit across the flats. He rode the long side slow, eyes scanning the far ridge. A magpie hopped on a dead limb, flashed white, and scolded no one. At the corner post, he found wire cut clean and tucked back like someone who apologizes while stealing. He wired it tight, twisted twice, tested it with his weight, and left a snares bell on the lower strand. A nut on wire, small enough to sing if hands came back. When he returned, the room had changed. Not much. The cups were in a straight row. The boots stood heel to heel. Her blanket had moved an inch toward the stove and stopped as if it had reached a line it would not cross without permission. Ruth sat at the table with the board. A single mark curved there. Not letters, not English, but a line that rose and then steadied, as if a river had learned to hold its banks. He touched the graphite with his thumb. Good, he said, not asking what it was. Meaning could come when it was ready. They ate with the window cracked to let steam out. She pushed half the pork to his side. He pushed it back. She cut it in two and settled the matter that way. After, she washed the spoon with a care that made it bright again. In the late light, hooves. One horse not rushing. Ethan stepped onto the porch, hands empty. The sheriff drew up at the gate, hat low, eyes higher. Found tracks at the river road, he said. Boot heel cut like a crescent. Man calls himself Pike here. Cobb, 2 towns over. Sells what he didn't buy. Ethan set his boot in dust and drew half a moon with the edge. The sheriff looked once and nodded. You seen him? His idea, Ethan said. Sheriff's eyes slid past him, found the shape of Ruth in the shadow. He tipped his brim to the room, not to pry, but to be counted. Judge signed a safety writ this week. Put your mark on it when you can ride. It keeps decent men decent. He let his horse turn. Paper doesn't stop weather, but it tells a jury which way the wind was blowing. Ethan watched the dust settle after the sheriff was gone. Then he lifted the gate, let it down soft, and went inside. Ruth sat with the board. She had added a smaller sign under the curve, a seed tucked in earth. Her eyes went to the door, then to his hands. He understood. He set a bar across the boards inside the barn door, a pin in the back window, a wedge in the hinge that sang. He brought in the rope from the nail and coiled it near the pegs. Soft lay, horse rope, not the other kind. He left the coil where she could see it and choose what it meant. Evening came with a little heat left in it. He set the lamp low. She moved to the bed, not to hide, only to rest. He sat by the stove and sharpened his knife without haste. Steel whispered against stone. Coyotes carried on a conversation that did not need them. Sometime after midnight, the bell on the fence sang once. Light, curious, uninvited. Ethan stood already moving, a shadow among known boards. He took the shotgun, not loud yet, and slipped out the back. The yard tasted of iron and plan. At the far post, a shape bent low, fingers at the twist. Ethan said nothing. He set his boot in the man's print and made ground speak. The head snapped up. The heel flashed that broken moon. Fence holds, Ethan said. The man straightened slow, hands wide to show they were empty of shame. Just looking. Done looking, Ethan answered. The man's eyes slid to the window, where lamplight made one thin square. Ethan eased a step left and broke that line with his shoulder. You walk out, he said. or I take you out and carry you to town like wire." Silence measured him. The man tried to smile and found he'd lost it. He backed away, boots sucking once at wet earth, and turned. The dark took him whole. Ethan followed to the gate, far enough to count his steps, near enough to own the yard. Inside, Ruth stood with the blanket around her shoulders, not shaking. He set the shotgun back on its pegs and the wedge back in the hinge. He poured water. She sat and drank, both hands around the cup, steady. "They'll try again," she said. "Once," he said. She looked at the board, then at him. "Paper? Soon." Rain threatened and changed its mind. He banked the fire. She lay down facing the room this time, not the wall. He stretched out by the stove, boots off, one hand over the other, listening to wind comb the grass into long thoughts. The fence bell stayed dumb. The house learned their breaths and kept them. At first light, he saddled the bay. He took the board with Ruth on the back and "stay" rising in pencil on the face and put it under his coat where warmth would set the mark. She tied the bandages neat, checked the knots, and stepped to the door with him, bare feet on cool boards, hair braided back clean. He paused under the lintel and touched 2 fingers to the edge, a small covenant with wood. She did the same without thinking. He saw it and said nothing. Then he rode for town at a pace a man can defend in court. When he was gone, Ruth opened the door wide and let morning find all the corners. She moved the coil of soft rope to the window and fed the tail through a loop she tied herself. Nooses mean one thing, halters another. She made a halter. She scrubbed the table with sand until the grain lifted clean. She hung the blanket on the line to show it the sun again. She set the board high on the shelf and pressed her palm to the curve she had made. At the gate, wind pushed dust along the road and erased old stories. The house held. The fence sang nothing. She stood in the doorway with one foot on the porch and one inside, and waited for a rider who had chosen not to leave her to die to come back with paper that said so. Town met him with iron sounds, hammer on shoe, chain on hook. A broom pushing yesterday off a porch that wouldn't stay clean. Ethan tied the bay at the rail and carried the board under his coat, close enough to feel its edge. Inside the sheriff's office, the stove burned small. Paper stacked in careful piles waited for names. The sheriff looked up once and then again. "That her word?" he asked. Ethan set the board on the desk. The curve and the seed below it sat quiet, graphite dulled by touch. The sheriff took a form from a drawer, dipped his pen, and wrote slow so ink would not lie. "Safety writ," he said. "House in person. Judge signs what he can stand behind." He blew the letters dry and slid the paper across. "Yours here." Ethan printed ETHAN with a steady hand. The sheriff nodded as if a fence post had seated firm. The judge's chambers smelled of cold coffee and older books. The old man read without hurry, weighed Ethan with the kind of gaze that knows a storm when it sees one. He signed, sanded the ink. "It won't stop every fool," he said, "but it leaves them fewer places to hide." Out on the street, men watched and then pretended they hadn't. Ethan bought flour, lye soap, a roll of muslin, and a sewing needle with a good eye. He added a small tin of carbolic because fever likes the weak, and he meant to give it no welcome. At the door, a thin boy with a scar under one eye lifted 2 fingers at his hat. Respect from someone who had none to spare. Ethan returned it. He turned for home by the lower road to keep dust off the paper. The sky held a pale heat. A hawk sat on a fence post and let him pass like a thought that didn't matter. At the wash, he dismounted, stepped down into the bed, and bent to study silt. Boot marks, one with the crescent chip, coming in, leaving out, light then heavy. He stood a long moment until breath and anger came back into order. Then he rode on. Ruth had the door open when he topped the rise. The blanket he'd found her in hung on the line, washed of its old story, water dropping from the hem like beads of another life. She took the paper with both hands as if it could break. She did not unfold it. She pressed it flat against the board with her mark and held it there until the wood felt warmer. He set the muslin and soap on the table. She touched the soap with a finger, then the muslin, then his sleeve, faster than he could count. Her eyes were clear today. The carved burns on her skin were healing clean. The new bandages lay even as fence wire. They made the day do work. Ethan set a brace in the barn door, where the wood swelled and lied. Ruth scrubbed the floor along the bed's edge until the grain lifted pale, then wiped it down smooth with a damp cloth and a patience that looked like prayer. He mended a cinch strap, kept the knife moving slow on leather so the cut would not wander. She boiled cloth with carbolic, wrung it with both hands, shook her fingers once, and smiled without showing teeth when the steam rose. At noon, a wagon rattled by the far fence. The driver didn't turn his head. A hymn bled from the church on the ridge. Soft as laundry flapped on a good day. Ruth stood in the doorway and listened until the last note drifted off. She did not step out. She didn't need to. In the heat's flat hour, he brought the cradle board from the corner. She had stitched a clean pad into it, muslin tight, seams small and proud. He ran a thumb along the edge and found no splinter. "Ready," he said. She didn't answer. Her hand rested there longer than weather could explain. Later, he walked the north line. Wind leaned on the grass. The bell he'd rigged hung dumb. At the corner, he found a scrap of blue cloth snagged on a barb, fresh, too clean for cowhand rags. He pocketed it and went home by a different cut so any eyes on the ridge would miscount him. The sheriff came near dusk, horse blowing easy. He didn't dismount. "Cobb was at O'Leary's," he said. "Bottle in one hand, talk in the other." He said your name and then remembered he had somewhere else to be. He fixed the hat brim with 2 fingers. "I'll ride short circles tonight." Ethan nodded. He tested the wash. "He will again." The sheriff's eyes went to the paper on the shelf through the open door. "Make sure the lamp's full. Men who read don't always read by day." When the sheriff left, Ruth lit the lamp and set it low, steady, near the board in the writ. She filled a small saucer with clean water and laid a sprig of sage in it, then set it beneath the shelf without explaining why. Ethan asked nothing. He set 2 cups on the table and salted the beans with care. He split the last of the pork with a straight knife and left the bigger piece where she could either take it or slide it back without making a speech. She took half of his half and met him even. Night hardened clear. The fence bell slept. Somewhere far off, a coyote laughed like a man who'd forgotten the joke. Ethan cleaned the rifle slow and left the action open. Ruth threaded the needle with lamplight, trimmed a loose thread from the cradleboard ribbon, and put the scissors down so the tips would not point at anyone. Close to midnight, the window breathed cold. Hoof, not many. 1, then 2. A spur kissed stone and said too much. Ethan stood and the room stood with him. He nodded toward the corner. Ruth stepped there, not hiding, just out of the gun's line. He crossed to the door, counted to 5, and drew the bar. "Evening," a voice said from the dark. Not loud, oily enough to slide under a door. "Man at O'Leary's says you keep what you didn't buy proper." Ethan set his boot on the threshold and leaned a shoulder against the frame like he was tired. "Gate's closed." A horse snorted. Leather creaked. The voice chuckled like it wrote the law. "Open it for business, then." "Writ says it's closed," Ethan answered. He let the paper's edge show in the lamplight, just enough. Words have weight when they catch a man in front of his friends, even if the friend's a liar with a gun. Silence turned brittle. "Paper burns," the voice said at last. "Men do too," Ethan said. "Some quicker." Hoof beats backed off 10 paces. Another voice whispered a warning a child would have understood. The first man swallowed, made it a laugh, and spat into dirt he didn't own. "Soon," he said, and tried to make it a promise. Then they rode, not far, not close. The kind of leaving that planned to loop back. Ruth let the breath out she'd kept folded. Ethan dropped the bar. He set the rifle on the pegs, poured water, and held out the cup. She drank and set it down quiet. "They want fear," she said. "They can want," he answered. Sleep didn't bother them much after that. They laid themselves down anyway and let the stove tick, count the hours. Near dawn, the fence bell sang once, then twice, sharp, not wind. Ethan didn't bother with boots. He went out in his socks, rifle low, breath smoke. The bell stilled. A dark shape ran the fence line. Wrong height for a horse. Dog. Mutt. Thin. Dragging something. Ethan sighed, then didn't. He whistled once through his teeth. The dog froze, dropped a length of cut wire, and bolted into the draw like a thought you don't want to finish. He picked up the wire and carried it inside. Ruth was up, hair tied, lamp trimmed. She looked at the wire and then at his feet and shook her head once at the cold. He set the wire on the table between the board and the writ. He trains dogs, she said. Sends them where men don't like to bend. We'll make bending not worth it. They ate without appetite but with purpose. When the first rim of sun cleared the ridge, Ruth took the board down and under her curve and seed wrote one word in English, small and square. Home. She set the board above the door. He drove 2 nails and left them high by the breadth of a fingernail so the wood could breathe when storms pushed. He saddled the bay. I'll go by the ridge and come in the back. See if they've set eyes. She lifted the muslin strips and the carbolic. I'll keep the fire even. He touched his hat. She touched the board above the door. Both nodded like they had rehearsed it. He rode. On the ridge he found what he needed. A fire ring still warm, 3 prints, one with the moon chip, boot ash, and a bottle turned on its side like a mouth. He kicked sand over it and sat his horse in the open, where any man with a glass would have to count him and make a plan that cost daylight. Then he turned for home. He saw her before she saw him, standing in the doorway, the blanket folded on the sill, the rope coil hanging by the window in a shape no neck deserved. Smoke rose straight from the pipe. The writ lay where sun could touch its edge. The fence line shone where he had pulled it true. He thought then, not in words, but in the easy weight that comes to a man when a field is planted right. Let them come and meet what we have chosen. He dismounted, handed her the blue cloth scrap from the barb. She threaded it through the rope loop and tied it off, small and neat. A flag only a house would notice. They worked until noon, then sat on the step and let the quiet sit with them. Far off, dust lifted. Not much. Enough. He stood, rolled his shoulders once, and went to check the hinge he knew to be sound. She wiped her hands on the muslin, stood behind the door's shadow, and rested 2 fingers on the words she had written. The day took a breath and held it. The day held its breath and did not let it go. Dust lifted on the far flats, a faint thread that thickened and went thin again, like a thought a man tries not to finish. Ethan checked the hinge he had already tightened, then the latch he had already set. The fence bell said nothing. The windmill clicked once and stood still, listening. Ruth tied her bandages fresh, then moved quiet through the room, putting small things where they belonged. The blanket, washed, sun-cured, folded on the sill. The rope, soft and harmless, looped by the window with a strip of blue cloth braided through it. The writ lay on the shelf beside the board with her curve, the seed and the word she had given the house. Home. She touched the edge of the paper and left a clean fingerprint on the margin, as if to teach it who it protected. They ate early, beans, a heel of bread, water warm from the kettle. Between bites, the silence worked like hands. Sheriff rides short circles, Ethan said. Ruth nodded. He can't ride inside a door. After noon, the light went flat and hot. A hawk drew a straight line toward the ridge and vanished behind it. The dust thread thickened until it was a road of its own. 3 riders, then 5. 1 horse limped on the left. The half-moon heel would be near the front. Ethan set the lamp on the table, but did not light it. He opened the flue and laid the bucket by the door. He checked the rifle and left it near, bolt open so the room would not feel like a trap. Ruth set a damp sack by the hearth and filled another with sand for the porch. She did not rush. She braided her hair back tight, tied the ribbon off with the blue strip from the rope, and stood under the board like a witness. They reined at the gate. Cobb at center, coat dry as if weather refused to touch him. Men spread loose, pretending there was space between them and what they had come to do. Fence makes a poor church, Cobb called. Open up. Ethan leaned a shoulder against the post. No service here. Cobb's smile cut sideways. You keep what was sold in front of men in the sun. Not sold to me, Ethan said. Not yours now. Cobb looked past him to the square of window light and the dark shape behind it. Ruth did not step back. She lifted the cradle board and leaned it against the wall beside the door, where he could see it if he chose to. He saw enough to frown. Paper won't stop night, he said. It doesn't have to, Ethan answered. It stops your story from sounding right in the morning. One of the men eased a horse along the fence line. The bell rang once, sharp, alive. Cobb flicked 2 fingers. The man stopped. Ethan didn't move. You can ride away clean, Ethan said. Use the wash. Sheriff won't chase a man riding wrong. He saves that for men who walk. Cobb's eyes were small and quick. You talk like a judge, he said, but you stand like a grave. Ruth's voice came from the doorway, steady. Leave. The word carried like a thrown nail. Some men flinched without meaning to. Cobb didn't. He took off his glove, let it slap his thigh once, and slid it back on. Fire, he said softly. A man to the right struck a match on his saddle horn, put it to a twist of rag, and reached for the dry weed at the ditch. Ruth was already moving. The damp sack slapped the ground before the flame found breath. Steam rose. The match hissed and died. She straightened and looked at the man until he looked away. Ethan stepped to the gate and set his palm on the cedar slat. Keep out. He didn't raise the rifle. Instead, he lifted a single warning shot into the post above the hinge. Wood spit splinters. The sound walked up the ridge and came back thinner. The horses left and right danced. Men cursed under their breath, the kind of words that apologized to no one. Cobb didn't draw. He leaned forward, elbows on the horn, chin high. You'll sleep, he said. 2 at a time, Ethan answered. Hooves on rock, far to the left. Not sheriff. A boy, maybe, driving a small string. Cobb's head turned for a fraction. His plans shifted to account for someone else's eyes. He touched his reins. Soon, he said. Paper burns faster than houses. Ethan let the quiet hold. Come back with a match, he said, and you'll ride home with less than you brought. They lingered long enough to leave tracks deep and clear, then wheeled and took the lower cut. Dusk closed behind them and tried to make it look like nothing had passed. Ethan held the gate until their sound was gone. The fence bell went still. The windmill counted to 1 and forgot the rest. He turned, set the rifle back where it lived, and picked up the bucket to pour a clean circle of water around the porch posts. Ruth took the brush, scrubbed the step where boots had spat, and rinsed it until the board smelled like wood again. Evening found the sky without color. Ethan oiled the latch. Ruth checked the window pins. He brought the saddle blanket inside to dry. She tied a length of muslin around her palm where a splinter had insisted on leaving a mark. The house gathered their work into its corners and settled. After dark, the sheriff rode in slow, lantern-shaded. He stopped short of the gate, letting the horse breathe. Saw them cut across the lower flats, he said. Didn't like the look of their thinking. I'll sit on the ridge a spell. Fire, Ethan said. The sheriff nodded. Buckets inside, stand by the door. Good. He glanced at Ruth and tipped his hat, then at the writ on the shelf. Judge wrote another line today, he said. Posted the fine for night riding with torches. It stings now. He turned the horse. Light the lamp. Let them see you believe in doors. When he had gone, Ruth lit the lamp and set it near the board. The glow lifted the curve and the seed like a brand without heat. She stood under it, palm raised, and didn't say anything at all. Ethan watched her and felt his breath drop into an easier place. They slept in shifts. He took the first chair tipped back 2 inches from the door. She took the second, a blanket around her shoulders, feet tucked under the stove's slow voice. Around the 3rd hour, the fence bell sang twice, close together, then went dumb. Ethan stood and waited at the window until his eyes told him it had been a coyote's foolishness and not a man's. Before dawn, a smell, cold iron, old smoke. He opened the door a hand's width. Nothing moved. A small bundle lay inside the gate. A dead chicken, neck twisted, feathers matted with creek mud. A cheap insult left by men who wanted fear to make their work cheaper. Ruth took it with 2 fingers, carried it far, and buried it where roots would find use for what cowards wasted. When light came proper, Ethan saddled the bay. Courthouse, he said. We'll make this loud. Ruth pulled the shawl close and stepped onto the porch. Bandages neat, shoulders square. I'm coming. Town turned and then looked again. A black woman who had been left to die, riding beside a man who did not talk much, carrying a board that said, home in pencil. People see what they need and then choose what they will keep. The sheriff met them on the steps, hat off, eyes direct. Judge inside, pen ready. Ethan set the writ down. Ruth laid her hand on the line that asked for witness and then signed the only way the clerk would allow. First mark curved like a river, second small and straight. The judge scratched another signature beside it, then wrote a sentence in the margin and underlined it hard enough to leave a groove. This house is not to be entered by any man without consent. He sanded it, blew, and placed the sheet in a folder with the weight of a door closing in daylight. On the way out, a woman from the bakery stepped into Ruth's path and put a warm roll into her palm. No charge. No speech. Ruth paused, nodded once, and kept walking. The sheriff fell in beside them and walked to the rail. "You won't be alone tonight," he said. "If they come, they'll meet more than a fence." Ethan nodded. "They'll meet a decision." The ride home was slow, not from fear, but from a new habit of looking with both eyes. At the ridge, they stopped and scanned. No riders, no fresh smoke. The wind had turned kinder. Back at the house, Ruth pinned the baker's paper to the shelf beside the writ, a small white square that said someone had chosen decency today. They readied without show. Water barrels topped, sand fresh, lamp full, the cedar slat straight. He strung a second bell loop along the back line. She tucked a spare matchbox under the eave, where only a hand that knew the house could find it. He wrote Ethan small on the back of the board under Ruth, not to own the wood, but to teach it both their names. She touched both marks and then the word home and left a clean thumbprint there too. Late light cut the yard into square pieces. They sat on the step and shared the bakery roll, breaking it with fingers, not a knife. She ate first and then gave him the middle. He smiled without showing it. The windmill clicked its one note and held it. Dust rose again far off, thin. Ethan stood. Ruth stood with him. He moved to the post. She moved to the door. He laid his palm on "keep out." She set hers on "home." Between those words, the house drew itself up. Not big, but exactly the size it needed to be. The dust veered. The riders passed at distance, heads turned, counting, and chose the wash instead. The sheriff's lantern winked once from the ridge and went still. Night came. Honest, dry, without tricks. They left the lamp low and the bar set. The fence bells slept. Somewhere a coyote laughed again and then remembered better. In the last minutes before sleep, Ethan spoke without looking at her. "Tomorrow I fix the north post double and set a stone under it." Ruth watched the flame. "Tomorrow I wash the blanket again and hang it high." He nodded. She nodded. The house kept both promises. The day let go of its breath. Dawn came pale and even, like a breath held all night and finally let go. Frost ghosted the grass. The fence bells hung quiet. Ethan walked the north line with a post hole bar on his shoulder and a flat stone under his arm. He set the stone beneath the weak post, drove earth tight, and tested the wire with the heel of his hand until it sang the right note. When he turned back, smoke rose straight from the stovepipe. Home above the door caught the first light and made a thin halo around the pencil. Inside, Ruth folded the old blanket for the last time. Clean, sun-cured. It no longer smelled of road or fear. She set it in the cedar chest, laid the writ on top, and pressed her palm once to both. The cradleboard leaned beside the door, muslin white against the grain. The blue strip braided through the harmless rope winked near the window. Soft, ordinary, a word relearned. They ate bread warmed on the stove lid and drank coffee that tasted like patience. Between sips, small work. A button sewn, the hinge oiled again though it did not ask. The lamp filled to the throat and trimmed to a steady flame. The house knew their hands now and moved with them. Near noon, dust lifted at the far flats and didn't change its mind. 3 riders, then 4, then 1 more. Loose line, purpose behind it. Ethan set the cups aside and wiped the table once with the flat of his palm. Ruth tied her hair back tight and looped the blue strip twice, as if to remind herself what had already been decided. They stopped at the gate. Cobb sat center, heel glaring its crescent like a cheap coin. His men fanned a little. Room for doubt to breathe if it wanted to. No one spoke first. Wind touched the sign and left it alone. Cobb pulled off his glove and let it hang between 2 fingers. He watched Ruth as if his eyes could shove the door open. "You think paper makes you stone," he said, voice soft enough for insult. "Night will teach you different." Ruth stood under home and didn't blink. "Night already did," she said. Ethan didn't lift the rifle. He laid his palm flat on the cedar slat. "Keep out. Gate stays shut." One man edged left, looking for the barn's shadow. The bell ticked once, a small warning, more conscience than threat. Cobb's jaw tightened. He had expected the song of fear. He got the sound of work. "Fire," he said. A torch kissed dry weed. Ruth moved first. Damp sack, quick step, heel planted. Steam lifted. Flame died without a speech. The man jerked back like a boy caught stealing. Ethan didn't smile. He let the quiet do the teaching. Hoofbeats came from the ridge, unhurried, certain. The sheriff, coat open, badge dull as pewter, two townsmen drawn long by duty. They reined up just short of the fence line. The sheriff looked at the torch rag, at the writ pinned inside the door glass, at the coil of cut wire on the porch rail, like evidence cleaned and saved. "Morning," he said, as if they had all met for fence talk. "We reading the same law today?" Cobb's mouth went thin. "House stole property." The sheriff didn't bother to glance at Ruth. "That's a lie you'll have to feed every time you say it," he replied. He turned his horse a quarter, just enough to show the weight behind him. "You walk away now, you keep your hands. You cross that gate, you leave something you'll miss." Silence balanced on a nail head. Windmill clicked once. Somewhere far, an owl decided to sleep late. Cobb looked at Ruth one more time, measuring what she would not give him. He found no rent in it. He put the glove back on. "This stays unfinished," he said, but the words came smaller than he wanted. "It's finished here," Ethan said. They rode, not fast, enough to say they had chosen to go. The dust folded itself back into the flats and tried to look like weather. The sheriff stayed a while. He took off his hat and let the shade touch his face. "Judge posted trespass fines in coin and time," he said. "I'll collect the cheaper first." He tapped the cedar slat with a knuckle. "That sign reads better than most sermons." He tipped his brim to Ruth, respect, not pity, and rode to walk the ridge until evening learned how to behave. When the yard was theirs again, Ethan fetched the shovel. Ruth took the bucket. They went to the spot by the fence where Ashes had dreamed of becoming a lesson. Together they turned the earth and poured clean water through it until the mud forgot the match. No words. Just work that meant something. Afternoon softened. They strung a second line for laundry, higher than the first. Ruth washed the muslin strips again and let water bead like seed on the edge before the sun took it. Ethan cut a short post from cedar and set it near the porch, tamping dirt with the butt until the ground acknowledged him. He nailed a small cross piece and fixed the board with her curve, the seed, and the pencil word home to it with two black screws sunk true. No more shelf, sky behind it, wind in front, name where a writer could not pretend he didn't see. They rested on the step with the quiet that follows a thing done right. Ruth looked at the cradleboard, then at the road, then at the cradleboard again. "Ready," she said. Ethan nodded. The word meant more than wood and cloth. It meant a roof that had learned their breathing. Toward evening, a buckboard from town rattled and slow. The baker's wife on the seat, a boy beside her holding a paper parcel like it might hatch. She stopped at the fence, hands respectful of other people's land. "I brought this for the house," she said, not looking past the gate until asked. Ethan lifted the latch, opened just enough, took the parcel, and closed it again soft. Inside, bread, a jar of milk with cloth tied under the lid, a stub of cinnamon wrapped in paper that smelled like holidays no one had planned. Ruth touched the jar with 2 fingers and then set it on the shelf beside the writ. She slipped the cinnamon into the cedar chest like a promise with a long fuse. Clouds stacked on the far ridge, and then decided to be nothing. The sun lowered and turned the rope loop gold, made a warm square on the floor beneath home, put copper in Ethan's hair and bronze in Ruth's cheek. She stood and stepped into that square and stayed until its edge climbed the wall and left. When the first star showed, Ethan took the carpenter's pencil and on the back of the board where only their hands would know it, added one small word below both names. Stay. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't have to. Ruth's thumb found the groove and pressed. Ceiling led to wood with skin. Night came honest, dry, clear, no tricks tucked into it. He set the bar out of habit, not fear. She banked the stove until it spoke in a low, even voice. He hung his coat on its peg and did not lay it over her feet. She did not need the weight anymore. She folded it herself and put it on the chest with the blanket. The old story buried by choice. In the deep hour, the fence bell stayed asleep. Coyotes argued softly and then agreed. The wind left the door alone. Ruth woke once, not from pain, but because quiet sometimes asked to be admired. She sat up, saw Ethan sleeping with his hand open on the chair arm, and lay back down facing the room, not the wall. She slept like a person who expects morning to keep its word, and it did. Light pushed through the cracks and made new lines on the floor. Ethan stepped out and came back with water that had thought about being ice and decided against it. Ruth poured coffee and cut bread and warmed the milk. He took the post hole bar toward the south run. She took the muslin down and folded each strip in thirds, edges meeting like good neighbors. Before he reached the fence, Ethan stopped and looked back. She was in the doorway with her hand resting under the board, 2 fingers on the pencil's shadow, not to hold it up, just to feel its truth. He raised his hand, 2 fingers back. She smiled with her eyes. Then both went to their work. No riders came. No bells rang. The day opened like a gate that doesn't squeal. What they had wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was steady. It would hold.